Okay, so I've already explained that the current thinking in evolutionary biology is that essentially something has to be for the good. If something is an evolved behaviour, it is evolved for the good of the genes, not necessarily the individual. And given some examples of situations where things have evolved that we have, breasts, sexual organs, childcare, which actually do not directly benefit us. Proximately, remember proximate versus ultimate explanation, proximately they benefit us. Our children may give us a great deal of pleasure, our sex organs might give us a great deal of pleasure, etc. But that's a proximate explanation. That is why these are behaviours that have been wired into us by our genes to ensure that we look after copies of genes in other organisms in the case of childcare. So we can sometimes talk about things as being for the good of the individual, because many things are for the good of the individual. Even things like, our love of sugar, for example, love of sweet things, love of fatty things, love of salty things, are all examples of where we're motivated to derive pleasure from eating food which is going to provide us with energy and necessary nutrients. But nowadays these things are bad because we've managed to create these on an industrial scale. Prior to that, in ancestral times, sugar, salt, fat were relatively uncommon, and that's why we developed a taste for them. Our appetite for sex is pleasurable. That's a proximate explanation. Why do we have sex? To say, well, sex is pleasurable. Yeah, that's a proximate explanation. But why do we have sex in the first place? To have pleasure? No, wrong way around. Sex is pleasurable because it has some ultimate purpose, which is pre-contraception days would have been reproduction. What about for the good of the group? What about for the good of the species? These are terms we often hear bandied around. There is a debate about this, and there are various people who argue that we do things for the good of the group, good of the species. And there's some links later on to people who say this and some of the arguments. But basically, I think most evolutionary biologists believe this isn't true. We do not do things for the good of the group. We do things for the good of the group to the extent that that will help us. So, for example, if we, are in a group and we're threatened by a rival group, think of we're in a tribe, another tribe tries to attack us. If we pull together to try and repel that, well, we're behaving for the good of the group. We do have that group mind, but I would argue, and many people would argue, that ultimately we benefit from that group mind, we as individuals, or even more correctly, the genes which cause that group mindedness benefit. The gene-centered view, or the selfish gene view, which says that genes are the ultimate kind of beneficiaries of any behaviour, is a difficult one to get your head around because it really does turn a lot of thinking on its head. But it's an important one to start thinking about, and we will think about this in other lectures and seminars. Things that are good for the group can be explained by the selfish gene theory, the gene-centered view theory, that everything is for the benefit of the genes. But where the group benefits over the individual, there might be a problem. But most evolutionists believe that group selection is very unlikely. And if you click on that link, there's a link to a paper which was basically written by tons of people. I can't remember it, 50, 60 people, all saying group selection is rubbish. And one of the reasons is, if you imagine a group of people who are all cooperating with each other, and we'll talk more about this in subsequent lectures, so everybody's helping. You help me out, I help you out. You do me a favour, I help you a favour. If a gene mutated, which produced an individual who took the benefits of cooperation but without returning a favour, then they would benefit from that. They would do better. They would have more kids. They would have more time. They would have more resources. So cooperative groups are always susceptible to defaulters, defectors, people who free riders, we sometimes call them. So selfishness would evolve, and exactly why cooperation within groups is largely the case will be addressed in another lecture. But group selection doesn't really tend to work because there's always a possibility, if we're doing things for the good of the group, that one individual will start to go, hey, well, I can work, I can look after myself. I'll take the benefits of all these lovely cooperating people, but not help them out. So I will gain more than them. So my kids should survive better, and will I survive? So a behavior can only evolve when it benefits the genes for that behavior on average. If it has negative consequences on the individual or the group, then tough. And we've seen negative consequences on the individual. Childcare, again, proximately provides us with pleasure, but ultimately it is a debilitating thing. Looking after children, they demand a lot of resources, food and lactation, a lot of time spent looking after them and making sure they don't fall off cliffs or get eaten by whatever or abducted or something. It's a significant drain. So it is a cost. But that is the way in which genes enable their own survival, is by making sure that we look after copies of them in other individuals. So genes can benefit, can have a negative consequences on the individual. They can have negative consequences on the group. But most of the time, our genes have positive consequences on us and positive consequences on them too. So most of the time it's harmonious, I'd say. But in certain cases, like childcare, it does have negative consequences on us and positive consequences for the offspring, as we saw with Hamilton's rule, C is less than B times R. Or I didn't mention at the time that R stands for how related you are, expressed as a proportion of 1. There's an article by Pinker there where he talks about the false allure of group selection, where he goes through these arguments, if you're interested. Darwin's other theory is often referred to as sexual selection. Natural selection is where we're, if you like, in competition against the environment. We're trying to adapt to the environment, whatever that is, whether that's camouflage in the Betularia with the peppered moth. So we're kind of competing against predators or against harsh weather conditions or against difficulty finding food. The better able we are to find food, to hide ourselves, to flee from predators, the more likely we are to survive. So we tend to have adaptations which allow us to do this, allow us to blend in if that's the kind of creature we are, to be able to outrun predators if that's the kind of creature we are. And to find food. So there are many different adaptations to this physical environment, and in level 5 I would have talked to you about disgust. Disgust is an emotion that we feel which is part of what's sometimes called the behavioural immune system. It makes us move away from, not consume things that are potentially harmful. Rotten food, bodily fluids, other people's bodily fluids, sometimes our own. We find disgusting. Remember I told you about the experiment in which you ask somebody to work up some spit and then swallow it, and then work up some spit in another condition. People are happy to do that. But if you ask people to work up some spit into a cup and then drink it, people don't want to do it. We've got very strong aversions to things which potentially harm us. And you could say the same thing about phobias, that the reason why some of the more common phobias are things like fear of spiders, fear of snakes. Snakes can't hurt us in this country. Well, there aren't that many of them, unless they're imported, nor can our natural spiders. But if we evolved in a country which had poisonous spiders and snakes, like Africa, for example, where people think we did evolve, our ancestors did come from, then it would make sense to have an innate, wired-in fear of these things. And that seems to be what we do. We do not have fear about the things that kill us, like cars and electricity, but we do have fears of things that can't kill us in this country, such as snakes and spiders. But the other kind of thing is not just about the environment, but it's about sex. Sexually reproducing organisms, usually there's an issue of choice. In many species, females choose males. In certain species, it's the other way around, and possibly in humans, both the male and the female, have a degree of choice in their other partner. More of that later. 2 kinds of sexual selection. It's about competition. It's intersexual. This is where males and females compete in order to have to have sex. But so basically, in this case, males will often find, many cases, the males who will have adornments that females can look at and decide whether they're hot enough to want to have babies with. So an example of this classic example is the peacock. Peacock with its bright plumage. There's competition there. The males and females are competing, if you like, with each other. And the males are hopefully being chosen by the females. The other one is intersexual selection. This is competition between males and males or females and females. So this is an example of this would be animals fighting in order to get access to females. So many animals such as deer, elephant seals, so on, will fight with each other, possibly humans, and the winner is the one that then gains the females. So in the first instance, the females are choosing the males based on some physical or psychological attribute. In the second one, the males are fighting with each other, and the winner basically takes the ladies. Kind of strange, but it's been observed that this is why in many species there's high sexual dimorphism. So on the left there we see two elephant seals. The left one is the male, the right one is the female. So the males will compete, that's why they're physically bigger, in order to access the females. Similarly with stags, the reason why stags have antlers is in order to display and ultimately fight sometimes in order to gain access to females. Same with gorillas. Peacocks, on the other hand, are slightly different. Either these guys, which are widow birds, which I mentioned in last year's lecture, remember, to remind you of this. These widow birds, this is the male widow bird on the right here with a very, very long tail. And it was often wondered, why is his tail so long? Because it certainly doesn't help him fly. Certainly the opposite, in fact, because this is going to slow him down. So he's going to be more likely to be caught by things that want to eat him because he's not as fast as he could be if he had a shorter tail. But also it takes energy to grow that tail and to feed that tail. You need more food if you've got a big tail like that. So why on earth would you do that? And the answer is, it seems to be that females like it. The girls like it. It used to be thought that this was just basically random. It's just like they like it. But ultimately, what is it that people like about this, or the people that females like about males with longer tails? Well, it used to be thought it was random. So Fisher basically says it was kind of just random. Females just happened to like him. But it was discovered when Anderson studied this that actually, if you snip the tails off of some widow birds, so some widow birds have got tails half as long, some widow birds have got tails the normal size, and then if you glue the snipped off tails of the first lot of widow birds onto a different set of widow birds, so they've got a super long tail, so you've got one with short, one with normal, and one with super long tails, then females prefer the ones with super long tails. So, why is this? Well, it seems to be that organisms want sexual partners who have good genes. For reasons that I'll discuss in another lecture, that the healthier, you want healthy offspring. Again, you don't necessarily consciously want healthy offspring, but your genes have built your brains to maximize their likelihood they're going to survive in the next generation. So they're damn well going to make sure that your brain makes sure that when they get stuck in, when you mate with somebody, have sex with somebody, that person is going to be having decent genes, because if you've got great genes and you mate with somebody who's got lousy genes, and all your wonderful, fantastic, pristine genes are going to be dragged down by these crappy genes, which, lead to, psychological problems or physical problems, poor immune systems, whatever. So so we're saying that basically your genes built your brain to prefer good genes. But how do you know the genetic quality of somebody? You couldn't, and in ancestral times, you probably can now, I'm sure there were websites, but you couldn't in ancestral times examine somebody's genes directly. But what you might be able to do is to choose partners based upon indicators of which signal good genes. So if a peacock's got a beautiful brightly coloured tail, there's no way that they get that beautiful brightly coloured tail if their genes were rubbish. If their immune systems were terrible, for example, if they had full of parasites, you couldn't get rid of the bacteria they had in them. So these physical features, such as the peacock's tail, the widow bird's length of the widow bird's tails, are indicators to the females that these individuals have good quality genes. So they will choose them over the ones with less long tails, less brightly coloured tails, because if they didn't choose them, if they chose the bad ones, then their genes would get mixed up with somebody else. So only the ones with the best genes can grow these wonderful tails. So it's kind of what's called honest signalling or costly signalling. It's honest because only the ones with the good genes can actually grow them. If your genes are bad, and this is what sexual selection is about, the basically sexual selection. The females are choosing males to have great genes. I'll finish off there with that, and I think that's enough for today. Thank you.